Okay, tell us all about this.
Oh, okay. I'm going to get right to turn on screen. But yeah, you know, I have had a really unusual experience over the last decade in doing books on Chinese American history. And while I've written about laundries and grocery stores and restaurants and so forth, there's sort of like a backstory about like how I got involved with this and how I transitioned from being a professor of psychology, writing books about psychology, and then moving over to something which I really didn't know a whole lot about. But I got a lot of help from people and found that this was a very valuable experience, not only for myself, but a lot of my audiences have given me comments about how meaningful it was for them. So that kind of, you know, encouraged me to continue on that. And during that course, I had a lot of very interesting experiences in doing the books. And so part of the book, Chinese American Odyssey, is to explain how these things all occurred, how they developed. All right, so, okay, so let's see. So I started out in psychology, as I mentioned, so I wrote textbooks in psychology. I taught psychology at Long Beach for 40 years. And then when I retired, I suddenly found myself in a totally different world, eventually writing 4 books. And so what I'm going to do today is like give you the backstory about how this thing happened. It's almost like if I were to write fiction, no one would believe this. I mean, it's just, I don't even understand it myself. So it's like a fairy tale, and you're all familiar with this song, that if you're young at heart, that maybe something unusual will happen. And so when I first started on this, I had heard from a lot of people when they said, oh, you came from Georgia? You know, that's so unusual, so fascinating, so interesting. And I would sort of roll my eyes thinking, I don't know why that was so interesting. I didn't find it all that, you know, compelling. But when I retired, I finally thought, well, maybe it is kind of interesting, so let me try my hand writing this. But I really wasn't sure, and so, you know, I kind of vacillated, and I went up and down about this, because I didn't know if anyone would read it. So that was the first book, Southern Fried Rice, was about my family running a laundry. We were the only Chinese family in Macon, Georgia, right in the middle of the state. So it wasn't until after I retired, on one occasion we were back east, my wife and I, and being in Georgia, it was understandable that we'd go to Macon and I would show her around where I grew up. And so we went to where the laundry was. You know, I wanted to show her the building where I grew up. And lo and behold, when I got there, it was like a shock because the building was gone. And so that was the moment, I guess, the real moment of decision when I said to myself, hey, it's almost like we win every year, the building's gone, I need to write a story about this, because the laundry you can see in one image, and then it's all torn down and you can see straight to the back. So that is the image of what was exactly behind the building. And you can see that where our building was now a parking lot. And I almost felt insulted by that, but anyway, progress, I guess. In doing that research, with the help of archivists and so forth, I found images of what that street had looked like 50 or 60 years earlier. Like that postcard, that's the very same building. And then you see in the middle the architecture of the laundry with 3 little windows above the laundry. It's exactly the same building. So that building was actually a laundry in 1906, which I didn't know about when I grew up there. In fact, actually it had been a laundry as early as 1885. It was the Sam Lee Laundry over several generations. So what was also fascinating was a couple of years ago I was reading a book and there was a footnote. And the footnote said that a Chinese laundryman in Macon, Georgia had been murdered. So that got my interest up. So I went and did research and I looked and found, and this is just a little clipping, that says that this man, this Chinese laundryman, was killed, you know, right outside his laundry next to the Lanier House. The Lanier House was that big, tall building that had several stories that was next to laundry. So I immediately knew that this man had been running the laundry that my father would then later acquire, say, some 30 or 40 years later. So I was glad I didn't know this at the time I lived there, and there were probably, because he was murdered in the very same building that I grew up in. So that made it rather personal. This is just part of a newspaper clipping because apparently this man was related to a prominent Chinese in Chicago. And they, came and had a huge funeral. The local newspapers in those days loved to sort of poke fun at the Chinese. And so they're talking about curious ceremonies at the grave. That was the headline. That was the nature of the journalism in those days. So I just give you a little bit of that to give you a flavor of how Chinese were treated in the newspapers. Another important thing that I learned, and I didn't know this at the time, but in 1913, a young Chinese girl was denied admission to the local white high school. That wouldn't have been too unusual, but she was the niece of a diplomat. Her name was Mei Ling Soon. You may recognize the name. That was the maiden name of the woman who would later become Madame Chiang Kai-shek. And so, a generation later, in 1943, thank you. So that's me. We were dragged out on a real hot summer day to attend a ceremony, and you can see the crowd here, because Madame Chiang Kai-shek was coming back to Macon to receive an honorary doctorate. So the very same girl who in 1913 could not go to the white school was now being honored in Macon. So there's sort of a twist of history there. I've also learned, actually doing later research after I did the book, that there were actually a lot of Chinese in Macon. And when I grew up there, I didn't know that. I wasn't curious enough to ask. I mean, the thought never came to my mind. So I discovered there were at least 13 or to 15 Chinese who were in that city before my father even came, starting as early as 1885. So after I did this research, I kind of realized for the first time how many people of that era, Chinese people, were in the laundry business. Because growing up in Macon and the only family, I didn't know there were Chinese laundries everywhere. I didn't know that most of my relatives, or many of my relatives had laundries, but they were all in the South. In fact, you can't read this diagram, but my great-great-grandfather had essentially 19 descendants of various levels who ended up in places like Chattanooga, Augusta, Atlanta, Birmingham, and of course Macon. These were all sort of distant relatives, and they were all in the laundry business. And so when I learned this, it was kind of thought-provoking. And then I discovered there were Chinese who were running laundries in virtually every state in the country, as well as all across Canada. This is a picture of my uncle's laundry in Atlanta. It's almost one of the last standing. And in fact, it may even be closed by now, but because it's in a really run-down area, and you can see all the graffiti that are painted on the side in the right-hand image. So that was also kind of a personal motivation for me, because I tell the story of these families that ran laundries and what life was like for them. Now again, you can't read all this, but so I started looking at archives, and in North Carolina alone, over a period of time, these were all different newspaper articles about Chinese laundries. Some of them report like burglaries, some of them report assaults, some of them are more positive. They just talk about a new laundry is opening, and it's written in a sort of a positive sense. But I want to talk a little bit more about this one, which I'll enlarge so you can see it. I got an email one day, and again, I'll just tell you what it says. The guy, let's see, did I skip one image? Okay, yeah. That's the newspaper article. This man was a retired chemistry professor in North Carolina. His name was eerily similar to mine. He was James Jung. And I got this email It kind of startled me a little bit, but he said, oh, you know, this is amazing. Someone told me to read your book, Southern Fried Rice, and it was really remarkable. Your story is just like our family story. We had a laundry. We were in a town, Kannapolis, and North Carolina. We were the only Chinese people there. And he got all excited, and he sent several emails to me. He sent one to his brother. He has 4 brothers, and he said, well, you know, they also lived above the laundry, and they said they also had 3 windows looking out on the street, just like Family Laundry in Macon, Georgia. So it was really kind of spooky. So what that told me was there was a lot of commonality in our stories between his family and my family, and probably a lot of other families. And so that kind of motivated me to try to do a little bit more documentation on that. So in the laundry book, I got like Liz Chan and like 7 or other 8 people whose families had laundries to write about their stories, because I could not assume that their stories were all similar, but they were highly similar. Their parents all came, many as paper sons. They all came from the same areas of China in Guangdong province. They all came for sort of the same reasons. They all kind of got into the laundry business kind of the same way. So then one day in LA, I was giving a talk about Southern Fried Rice, and at the end, this gentleman, Roman Chow, came up to me and said, your story is fascinating. What do you know about Chinese in Mississippi? So I said, well, I didn't know much. I knew one girl in college who came from Mississippi. So he said, you should write a book about Chinese in Mississippi. And I kind of thought to myself, well, yeah, easier said than done. You know, I mean, you just don't sit down one day and write a book. And so I kind of said, well, let me think about it. So over the next month or 2, I thought about it and I did research, and I found it kind of really interesting, you know, as I started talking to people who grew up in Mississippi, Chinese who grew up in Mississippi. So that led to this book that I spoke to you a couple of years back ago, Chopsticks in the Land of Cotton. And it's really a unique community. It's really sort of decaying and dying out because all the earlier generations have either passed on or moved either to Houston, to the Bay Area, or to Southern California. But this has been very rewarding to learn about these people, and they share their stories with me. And so I describe what their life is like. So here are just some images of some of the stores, mom and pop type grocery stores. Back in those days, you didn't have shopping carts or anything. All the merchandise is kind of behind the counter usually, and customers have to ask for it. But just like the families in restaurants and laundries, the Chinese very often lived on the premises, either in the back or up above. Some of it was to save money, some of it was for safety, to be on the premises and protect your property. A lot of Chinese in large cities would be attacked at night if they were out on the streets. So that was another reason not to leave the premises, and they had long hours to work, so this gave them more time to work. Here are images of 2 of the stores. When I was down there in 2008, we went around and looked at some of them. Most of them had been torn down or whatever, but found 2 that were empty in the bottom row in 2008. And above, you can see what they looked like in their heyday in the 1940s. So they're like museums. I mean, in fact, they just recently started creating a museum, a historic museum in Cleveland, Mississippi, to try to preserve their history. And I feel very fortunate to have gotten involved with this kind of at the right time. I mean, because there were still enough people around that you could talk to. And so they generated a lot of interest in this, and I've been down there about 3 times to give talks and so forth. In fact, last year in October, they had like a reunion, and there were people who hadn't seen each other for 50 years. They all had Delta connections, so they came to Cleveland, Mississippi to talk about their experiences and to talk about shared experiences of being Chinese in the Mississippi Delta during the heyday of racial segregation. And so what I did was I created a Facebook page for them, which has been very helpful. Some of the things that people post are just sort of personal. They're not all that historical valuable, but many of People have started posting pictures and so forth. I just copied one page down at the bottom left. There's an image about a dance company in New York which got very interested in. These people, the choreographer is actually from China. His wife is fifth generation Chinese American from New York. But they got very intrigued about Chinese in the South, and so they decided to do a modern dance interpretation called South of Gold Mountain. And so that generated a lot of interest. One of the most exciting things, at least for me, was someone posted, this woman, Linda Gatewood Bassey, posted this picture on my Facebook page that I created and said, does anybody know who those two girls I have circled in red in the bottom left? And when I looked at that picture and I saw that the identification was Rosedale, Mississippi, 1923, I said, Eureka, you know, because these were the girls who were in the famous Donglum versus Rice Supreme Court decision. This was before Brown versus Board of Education. This was 1923, when these Chinese girls were kicked out of their white school because they were not Caucasian. And that case went all the way to the Supreme Court, which the Chinese lost. But I had read a lot about the case, but I had never seen pictures of the girls. So this was the first picture that probably, you know, surfaced at that age. And it's clear evidence that at one point, I think in the spring of that year, they were in school. But by the fall, then someone complained, and so they, you know, told them to go home and not come back. Another Facebook connection in this electronic age, I got a communication from this African American woman. She was a student in Southern California, and she was trying to track down her ancestors because her father had run a grocery store in Clarksdale, Mississippi. We never did find it, but you know, it just shows the power of this electronic communication, and that people are really interested in these roots. And I have other stories similar to that I won't take the time to describe, but I've gotten communications from a lot of people who are stimulate a lot of interest in the Mississippi Delta because of personal ties to their family, people that they didn't know. Well, like one woman wrote me and said, you know, my mother never talked about what life was like for her in Mississippi, and your book helped me understand what it was like for her, and so she thanked me for that. So this is a poster for the performance that they did for South of Gold Mountain. In fact, I went to Arizona a couple of months ago to see that, and to my surprise, as I'm watching this, suddenly I popped up on the screen. So I was part of the show, although I didn't do any dancing. So what they put was an image of my two Southern books, The Land of Cotton on the right and the Southern Fried Rice on the left. So, as I said, I was an accidental author. I never intended to write the Chopsticks and the Land of Cotton until someone approached me. And so, it happened again. So one day I was giving a talk in Northridge, and someone said to me literally, he said, let's see, these words, exact words, more or less a paraphrase. So, he's the one who planted the seed for me to do a restaurant book. And I said to him, well, you know, I don't know that much about running a Chinese restaurant. I've been a patron, I eat in the Chinese restaurant, but I can't write a book about it. So I was fortunate again to find a lot of people whose families had restaurants who were willing to tell their story, you know, like Joe Chan here and several other people. So that, I was able to provide the history and the background research there and context, but the people themselves who came from those backgrounds, they were the voice of authenticity who could sort of tell firsthand experiences of what their lives were like. And the lives were all very similar, you know, of that generation in terms of what running a Chinese restaurant, especially out in the areas where there are very few Chinese, you know, like in the Midwest or in the South or, you know, other far reaches of the country. So this is a very interesting thing. When you go on the internet, you never quite know how you got somewhere. You start looking for one thing, the next thing you know, you're in, you know, Wonderland. So I found these images of the interior of Chinese restaurants. Now, all of these were fabrications. These were not actual Chinese restaurants. These were museum exhibitions, installations that a young Chinese Canadian in Canada, Karen Tam, created. She just finished her PhD in cultural studies at the University of London last year. So anyway, when I saw these, I was so moved that I instantly emailed her and I said, I saw your images and I really think they're great. And in 2 seconds, I get an email back from her, which sort of says something like this: "Thanks for your compliment. By the way, I'm in the kitchen of your niece at this very moment."
Oh, mama.
Yeah. So instant feedback. What is this? So it turned out it was my grandniece and Karen were both students together at the Art Institute of Chicago, and they were just sort of having a reunion, get-together in Syracuse, where Amy was living at the time. And so when I sent that email, she was there, and she probably said, "Oh, look, somebody likes my work." And then my grandniece came and looked over and said, "Oh my God, that's my uncle," And so out of that came the images that I used for the cover for the Sweet and Sour book. So that was, again, like one of those magical kind of things that, you can't make up that kind of stuff, it just happens. So here are just some images that I used in the restaurant book. That's not the real caption, but it might as well be. Because in the early days with the Bachelor Society, a lot of the men had no kitchen privileges, they had no access to cooking, and probably many of them didn't know how to cook, maybe. So that created an opportunity for other Chinese to start opening places for Chinese to eat, and where they could feel at home, just like you guys are when you all get together here, and get together, swear in Cantonese, or drink cafe, or do things like that. So this image came from Washington D.C. newspaper, and this kind of deals with how chop suey sort of, I call it turning the tide, because initially Chinese food was not very popular among non-Chinese. They were either afraid of it, it was too foreign, it was too exotic. And when chop suey got publicized in the newspapers because a Chinese diplomat was reputed to have eaten this dish called chop suey, and he said it was very good. This actually stimulated a lot of curiosity among yuppies, I guess you'd call them, to go together down to Chinatown to test it out, to check it out. But even then, Chinese food was not immediately popular. And you can see there was a lot of not understanding Chinese food. Clement Attlee, in red, is quoted as saying, "I just love Chinese food." Clement Attlee was Prime Minister of England in the 50s. My favorite dish is number 27. Chinese had to market, and then once Chinese food caught on, everybody else wanted to get in the act. So an Iranian and a Korean American opened a company called Choi, to make it sound kind of Chinesey. And I love this ad because it sort of says, with our product, you don't have to really know how to make Chinese food, because we'll have a little Chinese genie behind you guiding you all on the way. So it's kind of like foolproof. And as I was doing this research and finding all these interesting things, suddenly one day it dawned on me, because I kept reading about that in Canada, all across the plains, every little town, whether it's 100 people, 500 people, they all have a Chinese restaurant. And then I suddenly, struck me. My mother used to get Christmas cards every year from some little place called Norquay, Saskatchewan. So I looked it up on Google, and it's like population 300 or something. So I'm thinking, well, what were her relatives doing there? I said, my gosh, they must have been running a cafe or a restaurant. Now, they were mostly serving American food, even though they were called Chinese restaurant, because that's what the people there would eat, chop suey, chow mein, egg rolls, and chicken fried steak, and stuff like that. So I did some research, and without giving you the details, I had to make about 10 phone calls, and I even had to practice speaking in Chinese, because every time I called these Chinese people, they wouldn't talk to me. So then I started trying to speak as well as I could Chinese, and then they opened up. And so I was able to track down my relatives or their descendants. And indeed, they had run a Chinese restaurant. In fact, I got to meet up with some of the descendants in Vancouver because they, you know, once they knew what I was doing, and they got very friendly. And so when I was in Vancouver, they took me out to dinner. So that was kind of a neat personal adventure while I'm doing the research. So those days are kind of gone. You know, Chinese restaurants have totally evolved, and in the early days when, you know, it was mainly chop suey, chow mein, and also dinner dancing in the bigger restaurants, they're kind of gone now. And this is again one of those unusual experiences, but it kind of reinforces me for doing these things. Remember I told you why I got into writing a Chinese restaurant when someone said to me, why don't you write a book about Chinese restaurants? So I had mentioned it in the talk, and at the end, a lady got up and said, you know, that guy that you mentioned, he's the guy that learned how to run his restaurant from her father. So for that generation of Chinese, there are all these like less than 6 degrees of separation. It's quite remarkable how many people I've met who, you know somebody who knows somebody that I knew. So that was kind of exciting. So just a few of the other adventures that I write about in the book, and I'm going to skip over that because you can't read it, but I'll tell you what it involves. One day, I got an email from a guy who I vaguely remember. I knew him like 45, 50 years ago in San Francisco when we were in high school. And so he contacted me. And the reason he contacted me was he had probably ordered some book on Chinese in America from Amazon. So Amazon, using its quote-unquote artificial intelligence, said to him, you might be interested in this book by Jung. You know. And he looked at the name and, you know, he kind of thought, Jung, I think I know this guy, you know. So he contacted me, and then he told me about this guy, his good friend in North Carolina, who's a journalist for a newspaper writer. And so then the newspaper writer, this Caucasian guy in North Carolina, writes me and says, well, you don't remember me, but, you know, this Chinese guy, Don Mar, the one I was referring to, and he were good friends, and they had come to San Francisco, and I had gone with them. The three of us had gone to Chinatown to eat. Well, I didn't remember any of this, you know. But more to the point was, he got all excited about this connection, and then he wanted to write an article about my book, which was really nice, and he wanted to interview me on his radio program. So that was, again, like a unexpected bonus, and, you know, all these little incidents kind of help promote awareness about Chinese American history. So it just goes to show, you know, you really just can't anticipate all these things. They just sort of often happen almost like literally out of the blue. I don't know if any of you know Leland Wong in San Francisco. He's an artist. There he is on the left with me. I was wearing one of his t-shirts that he made commemorating Fong Fong in San Francisco, Chinatown. And its more recent edition, this is his shirt. But anyway, his name is Leland Wong, and we've become friends. He's very well known in San Francisco, Chinatown. So he emails and says something like, somebody told him that I mentioned his father in my laundry book. Well, I didn't know who this guy was, so I said, well, I'll be in San Francisco later that weekend, so why don't you come to my sister's house and we can talk about it. So he shows up. I didn't even know his name. So he's looking through stuff, and I was actually wearing that t-shirt with the Fong Fong ice cream cone on it. So he says, how do you know Leland Wong? Or something. And he says, my name is Leland Wong. I said, what? He said, yeah, the other Leland Wong and we're both Leland Wong. We went to the same junior high school together, and we both have checking accounts at Bank of America, and we often get our checking and stuff. So that was kind of really hilarious to learn about that. So he did not grow up in the South. His father grew up, had a laundry in Chattanooga. And so in the 60s, he decides to make a pilgrimage, a journey to go to the South. So he gets in his car and drives south because he wants to see what the South is like. And so he has these photographs. And he whips them out and he says, well, here's a picture I took somewhere in the South. I don't know who these people are. So I looked at him and I started laughing. I said, well, that's my cousin on the left. That's my uncle and aunt on the right in Atlanta. And, you know, he didn't have a clue who they were. So he's whipping out this picture that I'd never seen before. So, you know, some of these other little strange things. So a couple of years ago, the Hong Kong TV network, RTHK, contacted me from Hong Kong. They said they're coming to the United States to do 5 one-hour documentaries about Chinese in America, and they're doing one segment on restaurants and laundries. And I had created this illusion that I knew everything about restaurants and laundries. So they picked me, and they wanted to come and interview me. So I took them to one of the last remaining laundries up in the upper left, up in West LA. And then they were so interested, I guess they have deep pockets, they said, oh, we'll be there on a certain day. And I said, well, I'm not going to be there, I'll be in Portland. So they said, well, we'll come to Portland. And so I'm in Portland talking about Chinese restaurants, and so they came and filmed all that. And then they said, next week, can we come down to your house and interview you some more? So that was kind of an interesting experience. And so it just, again, shows that I could not have predicted that, or you know, but it was like a real windfall for me. And then I get an email from Lana Garland, African-American producer of documentaries. So she says, we're doing a dance and song program commemorating black washerwomen. Oh, I said, well, that sounds interesting. And can we come and interview you? And I'm thinking, why would you want to interview me? I can tell you about Chinese laundrymen. I can't tell you much about black washerwomen. But they sort of insisted. They said, oh, we want to talk to you. So I thought they were just going to phone me. But no, they said, we're in North Carolina, but we'll be out, you know, and come out and see you and interview you. So I said, well, you know, if you insist. So they insisted. So they came. I thought they would just bring a tape recorder. But they came with a 3-person film crew. Jazz, 6-time Grammy-nominated jazz singer, Nina Freelon, who plays the role of the clothesline muse. And so they come and interview me. My dog is extremely suspicious about what's going on. And this is part of their stage theatrical thing. So again, that was kind of just totally out of the blue, you know. I never could have planned this. If I'd wanted it, I wouldn't have been able to bring it about. It just kind of happens. And so that's why I say it's out of the blue kind of thing. And I mention these things partly because I think they're kind of interesting, but I'm trying to convey this to other people who are like trying to write something and wondering what can happen. Well, you know, you just have to go and do something and just go with the flow, just see what happens. I mean, all kinds of unusual, and in this case, positive things happen. So here's another out of the blue thing. One day, I get a correspondence from Solveig Bang. She actually lived in South Africa. Her parents were Norwegian. She had worked in Hong Kong for a newspaper, the South Coast Morning Post. And at the time she contacted me, she was living in India. And we became friends on the internet, and then she had worked in publishing. So she said, I will do a cover for you if you want, for any of your books. Well, at that moment, I wasn't doing any book, and I said, well, I can't pass up an opportunity like that. I better go write a book. So she took that picture of me in Macon, Georgia, when I was, I don't know, 9, 10, 11, standing in front of the laundry, and she transformed it into the cover. Oh, and so it was miraculous, you know. I was amazed at what she did, you know. And so, you know, just like an internet friend, it was like a gift from you know, out of the blue. So let me just sort of say some general things about all these experiences. Mark Twain was quoted about writing is easy, all you do is cross out the wrong words. If only it could be so. But I have learned from people, talking to people like you, many fascinating stories that I honestly feel are much more intricate and worthwhile telling than my own, to tell you the truth. But, you know, of course, not everyone's either motivated or has the time or wants to do it, because it is hard work writing these things to make them clear and so forth. And that's why I was happy to help other people tell their story, because I think they're valuable stories to tell and capture before they're gone, before they're lost, to history. And when I first started out, I didn't really think I was going to do very well, so I thought, oh, I can't afford an editor, I'll just do my own. But as I did more and more, I learned that, my editing's not that good, So for my last book, I got a person who had editorial experience, and it made a big difference. So anyway, publishing nowadays, for the last decade or so, there's publishing on demand, which means basically you can do a lot of stuff on your own with a little help, maybe, a little knowledge of computers, but you don't have to print like 5,000 books and sell like 20 of them and keep the other 4,000 whatever in your closet. Print on demand basically means they don't print the book until somebody orders it. So there's a lot of, efficiency of expenses and so forth. So that's made it available to a lot of people who could never otherwise write a book or publish a book. And there's an amazing amount of help from people who know how to do these things on the internet. It's amazing how helpful people can be in giving advice. And ebooks are also bringing the cost way down, so that makes more opportunities for people to write either fiction or nonfiction or whatever and get an audience. So I learned the hard way because actually, if you write a book, you want someone to buy it or read it. I mean, what's the point otherwise? But you have to market it. And, you might not believe it, but actually I'm very shy and quiet, and I don't really like to toot my own horn kind of thing. But I learned eventually that you have to do that. So over the years, I've become more like a, entrepreneur. I sort of find various ways to publicize books. And so here are just a few other things. And then I created a whole slew of websites, partly because it's fun. I like doing them like crossword puzzles, but to be honest, it's really like, there's nothing else to call it except shameless self-promotion. Just sort of say, hey, this book is great, you need to read it. And so the more you can, give information about it. So I created a website for the memoir, The Southern Fried Rice. Those are my two sisters in front of this laundry. I created one for Chinese laundry book. I created one for the Mississippi Delta. I created one for the restaurant book. And then for Odyssey, which is the one that I'm just doing now, I created one. So the other thing is I come to places like this. I've actually given almost 100 talks in the last decade. And people, come up and tell me their stories. And that's what kind of sustains me. If you're writing and you never get to talk to anyone who read your book, it's kind of hard to keep your motivation up. But when you find people who say, yeah, this is really interesting, this is like my story, this is like my family story, and they give you other information, it just really, sustains you. So also in the course of this, we all know how Chinese have been treated historically in America and Canada and other parts of the world, that we were excluded and recipients of a lot of prejudice. Things have improved, but still, there's this question, like when Michelle Kwan was in the Olympics and was in 1998 or whatever, the headline in the newspapers was "American beats out Kwan." Michelle Kwan, who was ABC, American-born Chinese in Torrance, California. So the language sort of says, in a way, well, maybe she's not quite an American kind of thing. Or all the jokes that were made about Jeremy Lin a few years ago, and like the chink in the armor kind of thing. So one of my missions now is, because a lot of my talks have been to people like you, so it's like preaching to a choir. So I'm looking for other audiences, and so I had this opportunity that just fell in my lap. When I was in Memphis a couple of years ago, they wanted me to talk to the 5th grade class at the university. I was a little intimidated by that because I didn't have a clue how to do that, And my first thought was to say, no, I can't do it. But then I said, well, what have I got to lose? I thought about things, and I found ways to do this. And so I gave a talk, which I think went pretty well. And so I think that's one goal that I want to do. And then just about a month ago, I get this email from a woman who took a popular sort of funky music thing called Uptown Funk, and they wrote lyrics about Chinese American history to replace the funky music. And her uncle was a musician, sang the song. And so the reason she wrote me was, on the left, she took images from my book about my father's immigration, and this is not my father, but this one. And so she wanted me to know about it, so wanted permission to use it, which I was glad to do. I can't play the video for you, but if you were to look on my Odyssey website, I have a link to it. And I showed it to some other people, and they thought it was really a terrific way to teach fourth graders, or to get fourth graders interested in something that they might find otherwise kind of boring. So, as I said, you know, when I first started out with this, I didn't have a clue. I never really intended to do more than one book. So the fact that I did 5 is pretty surprising even to me. And one reason I do it is I get comments like these from like the older generation telling me that they got a lot of value. I'm not going to read this all to you, but some of them are sort of saying that they found that this validated their own experience, so they were pleased by this. Because I remember once going and giving a talk, and half the people themselves came from Chinese laundry. And so I was thinking to myself, you know, I'm not telling these people anything they don't already know. Why are they so excited? And then I realized that they were happy that someone was telling the story. But also, what's important is to get the next generation. And so, as I mentioned, the woman whose mother grew up in Mississippi, that's the second one. I know you can't read it, but she said her mother never talked about it, and the book was illuminating to her. And I think at one talk I had talked about, because I grew up in the South, away from a Chinese community, sometimes I didn't feel I was, quote, unquote, not Chinese enough, because the other Chinese I knew all knew more about Chinese customs and traditions. But I since learned that there were a lot of other Chinese, even in San Francisco, who were isolated, and they also shared that feeling. They said, I don't feel like I'm sufficiently Chinese, you know, so it's a question of their identity and understanding. And then also it's important that not just Chinese learn about this. So I'm speaking more to audiences where a lot of the population is not Chinese, because other people in the country are interested, or hopefully will be interested, in what's going on. So, one interesting thing, you know, I knew how to write my name in Chinese. My mother or father taught me years ago, but I don't have much opportunity to practice, so I don't know much about calligraphy. So once someone asked me, what's your real name? Because, you know, Jung is not really my paper name, so a real name is Lao. And those of you who can read Chinese can see up in the top in the middle of my Chinese name, Mo Shi. And so someone said, when I mailed it, I couldn't write it for her. I said, I'll email you my Chinese name. So she wrote back, oh, your name is part of a Chinese, famous Chinese proverb. I was really shocked. I didn't know that. And basically, it sort of says, when you drink water, remember the source. And I thought, oh my gosh, the reason I'm doing this is I was foredoomed to do this. My parents gave me this name that left me no choice but to try to live up to it. So that was kind of interesting. And then my wife, Phyllis, who I lost earlier this year, has really supported all this. She, so anyway, I'd be happy to answer your questions. Yeah.
Are we ready to do our thing and tell our story? We have certainly a lot of commonalities to mention.
Right.
So I hope you push the right button and do our thing.
Yeah.
Our circle may be just for our children and grandchildren, but that's a start. Any of us ready? And it looks like we'll, and if they say yes, can they email you and say help or do this or that?
Absolutely, yeah. I'll give you my
Okay.
email address and, yeah, absolutely. And you know, because you're my family, really.
Yes.
I'm giving my book at a third off discount because I've been here 5 times and you've supported me. So I have a few copies of the book for $10 each if you're interested. I'll be happy to
Fine, okay. Let's come up and purchase the book because you know why? Jenny is our librarian here for the senior center, and right behind you is our library. If we purchase enough, will you donate some of your copies for our senior center library? And there's Jenny right there.
I only bought a few just because of the logistics of travel, but yeah, we'll see. But my other books, I only brought the Odyssey book. The other ones, some of you already have, but I do have some copies up the street at the East Wind bookstore, up on Shattuck. It's on University up near Shattuck.
We prefer to buy from you.
Well, I know, but yeah, exactly, yeah. That's why you.
Yes, I appreciate it. Oh, you know, there's one copy that's being passed around. We want to make sure we get it back here on this table. Oh, there's it back there.
Yeah, I have a question. John, since you're a trained psychology professor, can you explain to us why the Chinese are so docile, quiet, and peaceful but not heard?
Well, they're not that way in China. So, well, you know,
1880s to,
well, part of that, our parents, the earlier generation, warned us about prejudice and risk and dangers, and wanted us to be cautious and not get involved in controversy. We were like badly outnumbered, kind of thing. So, we didn't have the political clout. So that was kind of like a survival mechanism to some extent.
Discrimination rather than our personality.